the whole story of human civilization as we have it today all unfolds in that last 11,600 years. And what happens before that is a blank. They don't, in my view, take enough account of the role of cataclysmic events in the story of human civilization. You have roughly 1,600, 1,700 years of radical, unexplained deep freeze. We now know why that happened. It happened because of...
The conventional archaeologists will attack guys like you. I've seen this online a bunch of times. They say, if guys like Graham Hancock say that this civilization was here on Earth and it was very advanced, show me the pottery shards,
exactly.
Show me the linear curve of how they built up to the point to be able to manipulate these large blocks of stone.
That's what they say, and that's why 𝗩𝗘𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗘 is becoming a serious problem for them, because that, for example, that particular point was made in relation to the Great Sphinx of Giza, and the notion that the Great Sphinx might be vastly older than 2,500 BC. Well, the argument of archaeology was, how could that be so? There is no other large-scale monument, which is 12,000 plus years old anywhere in the world. If there was a culture that could make the Sphinx 12,500 years ago, then surely it must have made other monuments as well. Well, suddenly we have that other monument. We have 𝗩𝗘𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗘, and it's not even very far from the Sphinx.
That's true.
So, it becomes, the whole notion that the Sphinx may be much older suddenly becomes much more credible than it was before. I think the second point, which archaeologists are not taking into account, archaeologists tend to be uniformitarians. They don't really like cataclysms very much, and they don't, in my view, take enough account of the role of cataclysmic events in the story of human civilization. And again, there's new information and new evidence here. We now know it's really no longer in dispute that the Earth was hit by a fragmenting comet round about 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years. You can bring the resolution down that tight to a very exact date from the Greenland ice cores, because when comets hit the Earth, they leave a signature in the chemistry of the Earth all over the planet. Nanodiamonds and iridium and platinum. There are remnants, and these have been preserved in the Greenland ice cores, and we can say for sure this event happened 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years. And it initiated an episode that geologists have been aware of for a very long time, which they call the Younger Dryas. You see, 12,980 years ago, the Earth was coming out of the Ice Age. The Ice Age reached its maximum extent 21,300 years ago, approximately. And there began a gradual meltdown, not always gradual. There were some episodes of rapid flooding during that story, but it was a process of warming. And then suddenly, 12,980 years ago, for reasons that until recently it's not been possible to explain, the Earth was plunged back into a dramatic refreeze. Went back to colder than it had been at the coldest point of the Ice Age. And that's the episode that they call the Younger Dryas, and it lasts from 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years, down to 11,600 years ago, when suddenly the cold lifts and the Earth resumes its warming process. You have roughly 1,600, 1,700 years of radical, unexplained deep freeze. We now know why that happened. It happened because of that comet, which fragmented. Its fragments hit many different parts of the Earth, but the greatest impact of all was in North America, and it was on the North American ice cap. That's why there isn't a crater, because the ice cap was best part of 1.5 miles to 2 miles deep. Okay, and that fragmenting comet smacked into the ice cap. The crater was made in ice, not in the body of the Earth, and that's why we don't see the crater today. But what we do see are the chemical signatures of that impact all over the world. So the comet hits. The initial effect is dramatic large-scale flooding, because the ice cap is suddenly liquidized. There's a huge flooding event results from that, which leaves scars all over the North American landscape. And then enormous quantities of dust are thrown up into the upper atmosphere. These enshroud the Earth completely in a mantle of dust, which stops the sun's rays reaching the Earth. Then we go into the deep freeze, called the Younger Dryas, because the sun's warming effect on the Earth is no longer happening. And it takes 1,600 or so years for that dust mantle to disperse. It's possible that the Earth interacted again with fragments of that comet, and that may be part of why it ends rather suddenly about 11,600 years ago.
What's the data on sea level? What did it do to sea level?
Well, then you have a very rapid episode of sea level rise, exactly following 11,600 years ago. So you have your instant flooding, 12,980, sea level goes up, then it goes down again because you go into a freeze. Then 11,600 years ago, the Earth is suddenly warming up very rapidly and sea level rises very rapidly. And it's not an accident that 11,600 years ago is exactly the period that Plato pointed to in the story of Atlantis, because he said that Atlantis was destroyed, submerged by a giant flood and earthquakes 9,000 years before the time of Solon. And 9,000 years, Solon is 600 BC, so that's 9,600 BC, that is 11,600 years ago.
Wow.
That is the end of the Younger Dryas. Now, how could Plato have made that up, you know? It connects perfectly.
To try to say that that isn't a link is a conspiracy theory.
I believe it's a conspiracy theory. To dismiss that, as mainstream academics have done, they've tried every way to make Plato not say there was a cataclysm 11,600 years ago. They even say that he's talking about months instead of years. I mean, this was Plato. When he said years, he meant years.
Yeah.
Solon was his own ancestor. He received this story through Solon. He was reporting what for him was a very strong and definite fact, that there had been an event that had destroyed a great civilization 9,000 years before the time of Solon, and in our time frame that is 11,600 years before our time. You know, it just all adds up. So I think it's going to become more and more difficult for mainstream archaeology to dismiss this as we start seeing new evidence emerging all over the world. First of all, we now have a smoking gun. We didn't have that before. Yes, we all understood that the end of the Ice Age was cataclysmic, but we didn't have an actual very specific smoking gun. See, when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I focused very much on the window between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the moment that the comet hits the Earth, which we now know, but I did not know when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, is 12,980 years ago. Okay, that is exactly in that window.
Right.
I wasn't able to give my readers a smoking gun when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, rather just to say
I didn't remember reading that. So
it isn't in there because the evidence on the comet had not been discovered in 1995. This has all come out since 2007, and it's been a debate in science, but the evidence keeps coming in, and really no serious geologist is now disputing that the Earth was hit by a comet 12,980 years ago, and then you have this 1,600 year deep freeze, and 11,600 years ago we come out of it. And the whole story of human civilization as we have it today all unfolds in that last 11,600 years. And what happens before that is a blank. And I would say the reason that it's a blank is because of this horrendous cataclysm that overtook the Earth. We know that many of the great megafauna, the mammoths, the rhinos, died out during the Younger Dryas, and we now know what caused the Younger Dryas. So we're getting much closer to understanding what happened and why we are a species with amnesia.
Well, let me put the tinfoil hat on real snug here for a moment. Is it possible, that's the Ancient Aliens signature line, right? Is it possible? Is it possible that someone disliked whoever was here on Earth? Mm-hmm. Maybe there was a war, maybe they had gotten themselves in a lot of trouble, and that somebody had the ability to take that comet and deliberately make sure that it was going to hit the ice cap?
Well, David, that's a very interesting speculation, I have to say. Because, you know, there are serious studies now being done unfortunately by the warmongers in our own civilization. One of the weapons they're looking at is how do we use an asteroid as a weapon?
Right.
How do we target an asteroid at our quote-unquote enemies. What a shame, what a horror that human beings could even think that way, that our imagination could go in that direction, but maybe that's in our DNA in some way.
Right.
So it is not impossible. I can't sit here and say, no, that's absolutely impossible, that somebody could have fired that comet at us or deflected it from its orbit to the point where it interacted with the Earth in cataclysmic ways.
You and I spoke in the car on the way here about the Book of Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
And the Book of Enoch describes fallen angels, the Watchers, and that they interbred with humanity, mm-hmm. that they created a race of giants, mm-hmm. and that in the aftermath of that, Enoch was asked by the giants to talk to the Elohim, or God, mm-hmm. and say, please don't wipe us out, because God, Elohim, said, you guys have become wicked and you need to be purged from the earth. And that apparently was the genesis of Noah's flood.
Yeah.
Do you believe that we're talking about the biblical flood here?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. I think the biblical flood needs not to be seen in isolation. We need to understand that that is part of a global tradition of a cataclysmic flood. Often, by the way, accompanied by a radical deep freeze. If you look at the cataclysmic myths in Iran, for example, they don't speak so much of a flood, they speak more of a terrible freeze, a dragon that caused the world to freeze. And the Iranian Noah figure, who's called 𝗩𝗓𝗦𝗬𝗧, actually doesn't create an ark, he creates an underground sanctuary into which human beings go, where the seeds of all life are preserved. The same story is told all around the world, and with interestingly different angles on it. In some cases it's a flood, in some cases, as in the case of the Iranian myths, it's a deep freeze. And what we now know is that both things happened, that there was flooding and there was a deep freeze, and the biblical story of the flood is part of that global tradition, and it's well understood. There's been very good scholarship on this, that the biblical flood is genetically related to the Gilgamesh epic from Sumer, and really we're looking at one story told in a number of different ways.
Well, I'm thinking of Rand and Rose Flemath and
Yes.
When the Sky Fell.
Yes, yeah, brilliant book.
Yeah.
They did really fantastic work, and they were the ones who raised working with the earth crust displacement theory of Charles Hapgood. They were the ones who worked with and brought before the public the notion that Antarctica might have been the home of the lost civilization. And there's another author whose work is overlooked but deserves to be paid attention to, and that is Flavio Barbiero, who's an Italian author, a very scholarly man, who actually published a book called Civilization Under the Ice. I can't say it in Italian. It was published in the Italian language. Civilization Under the Ice, back in 1973 or 74, way before the Flemaths or me or anybody was working on this, suggesting that Antarctica might have been the site of Atlantis. And what's interesting about Flavio Barbiero's work is that he connects this to a comet impact. Flavio Barbiero is looking at pole shift or earth crust displacement, but he is considering the process that sets the earth crust displacement in motion. And what he suggests is that the earth is hit a glancing blow by a huge astronomical object, by a large comet, and that imparts the momentum that sets the crust in motion, or that creates the pole shift. So he was very, very far ahead of his time in that. There is a history to these ideas, and it's important to recognize Flavio's part.
If you like this video and you want to see more amazing content, go ahead and check out the next video on our channel.